The call came just after midnight, and the only words Felix heard before the line went dead were Hyunjin's trembling whisper, "Please don't disappear before I can tell you the truth." Rain slammed against the dorm windows as if the night itself was trying to force its way inside. Felix stared at his phone, the screen glowing in his shaking hand, Hyunjin's name still lit across it. The call had lasted only 7 seconds. 7 seconds that turned his chest into a storm. He didn't stop to put on a proper jacket. He didn't care that his hair was still damp from his shower or that his slippers were mismatched. He only grabbed the nearest hoodie and ran. The streets of Seoul glistened under the yellow haze of streetlights. Water splashed up around Felix's ankles as he sprinted through puddles, his breath clouding in the cold air. His heartbeat pounded louder than the thunder overhead. Hyunjin had sounded terrified. Felix had never heard that tone from him before. Not when they fought, not when Hyunjin cried after exhausting schedules, not even when he admitted in one rare moment of vulnerability that he feared being forgotten. Tonight, Hyunjin sounded like someone standing on the edge of losing everything. Felix pushed through the gate of the Riverside Park, his lungs burning. The place was nearly empty except for one solitary figure beneath the flickering lamp near the Han River. Hyunjin. His black coat was soaked through, clinging to his slender frame. Wet strands of hair stuck to his forehead. His shoulders trembled, though whether from cold or emotion Felix couldn't tell. Hyunjin, the taller man, turned. Even from a distance Felix saw it, the redness in his eyes, the tears mixing with rain, the fear he was trying and failing to hide. Felix slowed as he approached, his voice softening. "What happened?" For a moment Hyunjin said nothing. He only stared at Felix as though committing every detail to memory. The golden brown eyes, the flushed cheeks, the worried expression Felix wore so openly. Then Hyunjin took a step forward, and another, until there was no distance left between them. Without warning he wrapped his arms around Felix. The force of the embrace nearly knocked Felix backward. Hyunjin held him as if he were afraid the world might rip him away at any second. Felix felt Hyunjin's body shaking against his own. He heard a choked breath near his ear. Warm tears soaked into the shoulder of his hoodie. Then Hyunjin whispered the words that made Felix's heart stop. "I will never let you go." Froze, the river roared softly behind them, wind sweeping across the dark water, but all Felix could hear was Hyunjin's voice and the desperate promise buried within it. His hand slowly rose to Hyunjin's back. "Hyunjin," he murmured, "what are you talking about?" Hyunjin tightened his hold. "I thought I lost you tonight." Leaned back enough to look at him. "Lost me? I'm right here." Hyunjin's lips trembled. "I saw you with him." Dawned earlier that evening, Felix had gone to a cafe with an old friend from Australia who was visiting Seoul for a few days. They had laughed, hugged goodbye, and promised to keep in touch. It had been innocent, but Hyunjin hadn't known that. Felix's chest tight. "You thought I was leaving?" Hyunjin looked away, shame flooding his face. "I told myself I had no right to feel this way." His voice cracked. "You're free to be with anyone you want." Rainwater dripped from his lashes as he finally met Felix's eyes. "But when I imagined you choosing someone else, I couldn't breathe." Stood silent. For years they had danced around what lay between them. Late-night conversations after everyone else had fallen asleep. Lingering touches disguised as jokes. The way Hyunjin always sought Felix first when he was overwhelmed. The way Felix instinctively turned to Hyunjin whenever his own insecurities grew too loud. Either had dared to name it, perhaps because numbing it would make it real, and real things could be broken. Hyunjin took a shaky breath. "There's something you don't know." His fingers loosened slightly, though he remained close enough that Felix could feel every tremor. "When I was younger, the people I loved always left, some because they wanted to, some because I pushed them away before they could hurt me." His eyes glistened. "I kept telling myself that if I never confessed, then I would never lose you." Swallowed hard. "Hyunjin, but tonight, when I thought you were walking away with someone else," a tear slid down his cheek. "I realized that losing you silently would hurt more than being rejected." Honesty in his voice stripped away every defense Felix had ever built. He reached up and brushed wet hair from Hyunjin's face. "You idiot," Felix whispered, his own eyes stinging. Hyunjin gave a broken laugh. "That sounds about right," cupped his cheek. "You should have told me sooner." Hyunjin's breath hitched. Felix smiled through tears. "Because I've been in love with you for a very long time." The world seemed to stop. Hyunjin stared at him, disbelieving. The vulnerable artist who painted emotions in secret sketchbooks, who hid his fear behind elegance and teasing smiles, suddenly looked younger, softer, almost fragile. "You mean that?" Felix nodded. "With all of my heart." A sob escaped Hyunjin before he crashed forward, kissing Felix with a tenderness that felt like years of longing finally finding a home. The kiss tasted of rain and salt and relief. Felix's hand slid into Hyunjin's soaked hair as he kissed him back. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only warmth blooming in the middle of a cold, stormy night. When they finally pulled apart, Hyunjin rested his forehead against Felix's. "I was so scared," he whispered. Felix traced his thumb across Hyunjin's cheekbone. "You don't have to be scared anymore." Hyunjin closed his eyes. "I still am." "Then let me stay until the fear goes away." A small smile appeared on Hyunjin's lips. "That might take forever." Answering smile was radiant enough to outshine the storm. "Good." The rain gradually softened to a mist. They sat together on the bench by the river, wrapped in one another's arms. Hyunjin spoke of the loneliness he had hidden behind perfect performances and effortless charm. Felix confessed how often he had felt not good enough, how he worried his bright smile was all anyone truly saw. They shared the parts of themselves they rarely showed the world. The frightened child in Hyunjin who expected abandonment. The sensitive soul in Felix who feared he was loved only when he was cheerful. Instead of turning away, they listened. and in listening they healed. Hours later, dawn painted the horizon with silver and pale pink. The city stirred awake around them, but they remained in their own quiet universe. Hyunjin held Felix from behind, his chin resting on Felix's shoulder. The embrace was gentler now, no longer desperate, steady, certain, safe. Felix covered Hyunjin's hands with his own. "So," he said softly, "you really meant what you said?" Hyunjin pressed a kiss to the side of his neck, every word, turned within his arms. Their eyes met in the growing light. Hyunjin brushed his fingertips across Felix's cheek and whispered once more, this time with peace instead of fear. "I will never let you go." Felix's tears returned, but they were no longer born of uncertainty. He smiled and wrapped his arms around the person who had always felt like home. "Then don't." As the first sunlight spilled across the river, Hyunjin held Felix close, not as someone terrified of loss, but as someone who had finally found the courage to love openly, fully, and without fear. Morning sunlight poured through the dormitory windows in soft ribbons of gold, but Felix did not remember falling asleep. One moment he had been sitting beside Hyunjin on the bench by the Han River, wrapped in the warmth of his arms as dawn painted the sky pink. The next he was opening his eyes to the familiar scent of clean sheets, lavender detergent, and the faint trace of Hyunjin's cologne. And Hyunjin was still there. Felix lay on his side, his head resting against Hyunjin's chest. One of Hyunjin's arms was draped securely around his waist, fingers curled into the fabric of Felix's shirt as though even in sleep he refused to let go. The steady beat of Hyunjin's heart echoed beneath Felix's ear, strong, calm, real. For a long moment Felix simply listened. He let the truth settle into him slowly, like sunlight warming frozen skin. This was not a dream. Hyunjin loved him and Felix loved him. The realization made his chest ache with a tenderness so overwhelming he had to bite his lip to keep from crying again. Hyunjin stirred, his fingers tightened instinctively around Felix before his eyes fluttered open. For a split second, confusion clouded his features. Then he looked down and saw Felix in his arms. The uncertainty disappeared, a sleepy, breathtaking smile spread across his face. "Good morning," Hyunjin whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Felix felt his cheeks heat. "Morning." Hyunjin lifted a hand to brush Felix's hair away from his forehead. His fingertips moved slowly, reverently, as though he still could not believe Felix was truly there. "I was afraid I'd wake up and find out last night never happened." Heart squeezed. He tilted his head and kissed Hyunjin softly. "It happened." Hyunjin exhaled shakily, eyes glistening. Thank God. They stayed like that for several quiet minutes, tangled in blankets and each other, speaking in gentle kisses and lingering touches. Outside the bedroom door the world waited with its schedules, cameras, and expectations. But inside this room there were only two hearts learning how to beat in the same rhythm. Eventually a loud knock shattered the silence. Hyunjin. Changbin's voice boomed from the hallway. "Seo Changbin, we're ordering breakfast. Are you alive?" Felix buried his face in Hyunjin's chest, laughing helplessly. Hyunjin groaned. "Pretend we're not here." "Knock." "Too late," came Han's unmistakable voice. "Han Jae-sung," I heard giggling. Hyunjin closed his eyes in defeat. "We're doomed." Looked up at him, his eyes sparkling. "Maybe." Hyunjin studied his face, his expression softening. "But if being with you is what gets us caught, I don't care." Sincerity in his voice stole Felix's breath. Before Felix could respond, the bedroom door creaked open. Bang Chan stood in the doorway holding a coffee mug. Bang Chan he took in the scene in a single glance. Felix curled against Hyunjin, Hyunjin's arm around Felix, both of them flushed and smiling like they had discovered a secret too beautiful to hide. Chan blinked, then he smiled. "Well," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "it's about time." Felix's face turned crimson. Hyunjin buried his face in Felix's shoulder. Chan chuckled. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, and for the record, no one is surprised." He closed the door again. Silence followed. Then Felix and Hyunjin burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that came from relief, from years of tension dissolving all at once. When the laughter faded, Felix touched Hyunjin's cheek. "Do you regret it?" Hyunjin looked at him as though the question itself were impossible. "Loving you," Felix nodded. Hyunjin's eyes shone. "Never." He kissed Felix slowly with a sweetness that left Felix breathless. "I regret only the time we lost pretending." Swallowed against the lump in his throat. "Then let's not lose any more." Hyunjin pressed their foreheads together. "Agreed." The day unfolded in a blur of shy smiles and stolen glances. At breakfast, the other members teased them mercilessly but with unmistakable affection. Stray Kids Minyu rolled his eyes and told them to stop looking at each other like they were in a drama. Lino Suman muttered that he was relieved they had finally sorted out whatever that was. Suman In simply smiled and passed Felix another piece of toast. In everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because Felix no longer had to hide how his heart raced whenever Hyunjin smiled at him. Later that evening after practice, Felix stepped into the studio to find the lights dimmed and candles flickering along the mirrored wall. His breath caught. Hyunjin stood in the center of the room, hands clasped nervously in front of him. On the floor beside him lay a sketchbook. Felix recognized it immediately. Hyunjin's private sketchbook, the one he never let anyone touch. Hyunjin picked up the book and held it out. "I want to show you something." Accepted it carefully and opened to the first page. His breath hitched. A portrait of him turned the page, another and another. Felix laughing. Felix sleeping on the couch. Felix singing with his eyes closed. Felix smiling at Hyunjin. Dozens of drawings, perhaps hundreds, years of love captured in pencil and watercolor. Tears blurred Felix's vision. You drew all of these, Hyunjin nodded, cheeks flushed. I missed you, whenever I was afraid to tell you, whenever I loved you too much to keep it inside. Looked up, crying openly now. Hyunjin took a shaky step closer. You asked me this morning if I regretted it. Voice trembled. I don't. And I want you to know that if the world becomes too loud, if you doubt yourself, if you ever feel alone. He cupped Felix's face with both hands. I'll be here. His tears spilled over. Hyunjin rested his forehead against his and whispered the words that had already become the safest sound Felix knew. I will never let you go. Closed his eyes and wrapped his arms around him. This time there was no rain, no fear, only warmth, only certainty, only love so deep it felt endless. And in Hyunjin's embrace, surrounded by years of hidden drawings and the quiet glow of candlelight, Felix understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. Home was not a place. It was the person who held you as if you were the most precious thing in the world. Felix did not notice that he was trembling until Hyunjin wiped away his tears with his thumbs and smiled as if every emotion on Felix's face was something worth protecting. The dance studio was silent except for their breathing and the faint hum of the city outside. Candles flickered along the mirrored walls, casting warm light over the scattered sketches at their feet. Hundreds of versions of Felix looked back at him from the pages of Hyunjin's sketchbook, laughing, sleeping, singing, existing in all the small moments Hyunjin had loved in secret. Felix clutched the sketchbook to his chest. I don't know what to say. Hyunjin tucked a strand of blonde hair behind Felix's ear. Then don't say anything. Eyes softened. You know I can't do that. Hyunjin laughed quietly, the sound low and affectionate. That's one of the reasons I love you. Words still sent a rush of warmth through Felix. No matter how many times he heard them, they felt like sunlight breaking through clouds he had carried for years. He reached for Hyunjin's hand and laced their fingers together. Come with me. Hyunjin blinked. Where? You'll see. They left the studio with the sketchbook tucked under Felix's arm and their hands brushing together whenever they thought no one was looking. The building was nearly empty, and the cool night air wrapped around them as they stepped onto the rooftop. Seoul stretched beneath them in a sea of lights. Cars moved like glowing rivers through the streets. Neon signs blinked in the distance. Above them the sky was dark velvet, dotted with faint stars barely visible beyond the city haze. Felix walked to the edge of the rooftop garden and sat on the wooden bench where he often came to think when life became overwhelming. Hyunjin sat beside him. For a while neither spoke. Felix rested his head on Hyunjin's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of paint, soap, and the faint sweetness that was uniquely Hyunjin. This is where I came when I missed home, Felix said softly. Hyunjin intertwined their fingers. You never told me. I didn't tell anyone, traced circles over Hyunjin's knuckles. There were nights when everything felt too big. The schedules, the pressure, the fear of disappointing people. He swallowed. I would sit here and smile for everyone in my mind because smiling was the one thing I thought I was good at. Hyunjin turned to look at him. Felix's voice grew quieter. Some nights even smiling felt exhausting. Pain flickered across Hyunjin's features. Why didn't you tell me? Felix gave a small, fragile smile. Because you were carrying so much too. Hyunjin reached up and cupped his face. Felix, loving someone isn't about protecting them from your pain. It's about trusting them enough to share it. His eyes filled again. You always know exactly what to say. Hyunjin kissed his forehead. Only because I've rehearsed these conversations in my head for years. Laughed through his tears, then his expression turned serious. There's something I need you to know. Hyunjin's thumb brushed his cheek. Anything. Looked out over the city. I used to think people loved me because I was cheerful, because I made things lighter. His voice trembled. I worried that if I stopped smiling, if I showed the parts of me that were insecure or sad, I'd become too difficult to love. Hyunjin's hand tightened around his. Felix finally met his eyes. You saw all of those parts anyway. Hyunjin nodded slowly, and I fell in love with every single one. The words broke something open inside Felix. He leaned forward, kissing Hyunjin with all the gratitude and tenderness swelling in his heart. The kiss was deep but gentle, a promise made without words. When they parted, Hyunjin rested his forehead against Felix's. I love your laugh, he whispered. He kissed the corner of Felix's eye. I love the way you cry when you're overwhelmed. A kiss to his cheek. I love how you hum when you're half asleep. A kiss to the tip of his nose. I love your kindness, your fears, your doubts, your strength. Finally, Hyunjin pressed a soft kiss to Felix's lips. I love all of you. Shoulders shook with emotion. No one had ever loved him so completely. He wrapped his arms around Hyunjin and held on. I love you too, he whispered into the curve of Hyunjin's neck. More than I know how to explain. Hyunjin smiled against his hair. Then spend the rest of your life showing me. Pulled back, eyes wide and shining. Was that your way of asking me to stay forever? A blush rose to Hyunjin's cheeks. Maybe. Grinned, radiant and tearful. Then my answer is yes. City lights sparkled below them, but neither noticed. They were too busy memorizing each other. Too busy learning the shape of a future they had both secretly wanted. As the night deepened, they spoke of simple dreams, cooking breakfast together on quiet mornings, traveling to Australia to visit Felix's family, watching Hyunjin paint while Felix wrote songs nearby, growing older without ever having to wonder if they were loved. The dreams were ordinary, and because they were ordinary, they felt more precious than anything else. Eventually, the rooftop grew colder. Hyunjin wrapped his coat around Felix's shoulders and drew him close. Felix nestled against him, warm and content. Promise me something, Felix murmured. Anything. I ever doubt myself again. Hyunjin tilted his chin up. I'll remind you who you are, smiled. If you ever feel like everyone will leave, Hyunjin's eyes softened, you'll stay. Kissed him once, slow and cert. Always. They remained on the rooftop until the first hint of dawn painted the horizon. When they finally rose to leave, Hyunjin slipped his fingers through Felix's. Their steps were unhurried, their hearts were steady. And as they walked back downstairs together, there was no fear left between them, only trust, only devotion, only the quiet, extraordinary comfort of knowing that after years of searching, both of them had found exactly where they belonged in each other.
A week passed, and Felix still woke up each morning with the same stunned happiness. For years, he had loved Hyunjin in silence, turning his feelings into smiles, small gestures, and songs he never dared to finish. Now he opened his eyes to the sight of Hyunjin sleeping beside him, one arm thrown protectively over Felix's waist, his face peaceful in a way Felix had never seen before. Love had changed them both, not by making life easier, but by making them braver. The schedules were still exhausting. Cameras still followed them. Expectations still pressed heavily on their shoulders, yet every difficult day ended the same way, with Hyunjin's fingers intertwined with Felix's, with whispered "I love you" in the dark, with the certainty that neither of them was carrying the weight alone anymore. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Felix returned to the dorm to find the living room empty. A faint melody drifted from Hyunjin's room. Felix followed the sound. The door was slightly open. Inside, Hyunjin sat on the floor beside a canvas, a paintbrush resting loosely between his fingers. The painting was unfinished, but Felix immediately recognized himself standing beneath a star-filled sky, reaching toward a figure made of light. Hyunjin looked up and smiled. "You're home," leaned against the doorway, warmth flooding his chest. "You painted again." Hyunjin set the brush aside. "I needed to," crossed the room and sat beside him. "What is this one about?" Hyunjin studied the canvas. "It's about finding the person who taught me that being vulnerable isn't weakness." Turned to Felix. "It's about you." Throat tightened. He touched the wet paint carefully. "You make me look like magic." Hyunjin brushed his knuckles against Felix's cheek. "That's because that's what you are to me." Laughed softly, though tears glimmered in his eyes. Sometimes he still could not understand how someone could see him so clearly and love him even more because of what they found. Hyunjin noticed the tears and tilted his head. "What are you thinking?" Felix exhaled. "I'm thinking that I spent so much time believing I had to earn love." Hyunjin took both of his hands. "You never had to earn mine." Felix's voice trembled. "And yet you give it so freely." Hyunjin kissed his fingertips one by one. "Because loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." The words settled into Felix like a promise. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against Hyunjin's. "I want to write a song." Hyunjin smiled. "About us?" Felix nodded. "About what it feels like to be held when you're falling apart." Hyunjin's eyes shimmered. "That sounds beautiful." "It sounds like you." They spent the next several hours together in companionable silence. Hyunjin painted. Felix sat beside him with a notebook in his lap, writing lyrics between stolen kisses and lingering touches. When Felix finally sang the melody aloud, his voice was soft and unguarded. The song spoke of rain-soaked nights, trembling confessions, and the kind of embrace that turned fear into home. By the time he finished, Hyunjin was crying. Felix set the notebook aside. "Was it that bad?" Hyunjin laughed through tears and pulled him close. "It was perfect." Held Felix tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "No one has ever loved me this way." Nestled deeper into his arms. "I plan to keep doing it." Hyunjin smiled into his hair. "Good." That weekend, they flew to Australia for a short break. Felix was nervous, not because he doubted Hyunjin, but because bringing someone home meant offering them the most personal parts of your world. The ocean breeze greeted them as they stepped out into the bright Australian sunlight. Felix's family welcomed Hyunjin with immediate warmth. Hyunjin bowed politely, then relaxed as Felix's mother enveloped him in a heartfelt hug. During dinner, Felix watched as Hyunjin laughed with his sisters, listened attentively to childhood stories, and helped clear the table without being asked. He fit so naturally into Felix's life that it made Felix's chest ache. Later that night, they walked along the beach under a sky crowded with stars. The sand was cool beneath their feet. Waves rolled in with a steady rhythm, foaming around their ankles. Hyunjin slipped his hand into Felix's. "You grew up here." Nodded. "When I was little, I used to come to this beach whenever I felt overwhelmed." Hyunjin looked out at the water. "It feels peaceful." Turned to him. It feels like home, Hyunjin smiled. Now Felix squeezed his hand. Now home is wherever you are. Hyunjin stopped walking, moonlight silvered his features and emotion shone openly in his eyes. You mean that? Felix stepped closer. With everything I am. Hyunjin cupped his face and kissed him slowly, tenderly, with the sound of the ocean surrounding them. When they parted, Hyunjin rested his forehead against Felix's. I used to think love meant waiting for someone to leave. Voice trembled slightly. But with you, love feels like staying. Brushed away the tear sliding down Hyunjin's cheek. Then stay with me. Hyunjin smiled through his tears. For as long as you'll have me. Wrapped his arms around him, holding him close beneath the endless sky. For the rest of my life. The waves continued to rise and fall, ancient and constant. And there, between the ocean and the stars, Felix and Hyunjin stood together, no longer afraid of what they might lose, but grateful for what they had found. A love gentle enough to heal old wounds, strong enough to outlast every fear, and certain enough to call forever by its name. The rest of their stay in Australia unfolded like a dream neither of them wanted to end. Each morning, Felix woke to the sound of waves outside his childhood bedroom, and to Hyunjin's sleepy arms wrapped around him beneath the blankets. Sunlight spilled across the floor, and for the first time in years, Felix felt completely at peace. Hyunjin loved every part of Felix's world. He loved the framed family photos lining the hallway. He loved the way Felix's mother fussed over whether he had eaten enough. He loved the laughter that filled the house late into the night. Most of all, he loved seeing Felix become lighter, freer. At home, Felix was not just an idol, a performer, or the person everyone depended on to brighten the room. He was simply Felix, and Hyunjin fell in love with him all over again. On their final evening, Felix led Hyunjin back to the beach just before sunset. The horizon burned with shades of orange and rose. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and the tide whispered across the sand. Felix spread a blanket near the dunes. Hyunjin sat beside him, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. For a while they watched the sun sink slowly toward the water. Then Felix reached into his pocket. Hyunjin looked up. Felix's hands were trembling. Licks. Felix took a steadying breath. I've been thinking about how much my life changed the night you called me. He turned to face Hyunjin fully. Before that, I thought love was something fragile. Something you could lose if you said the wrong thing or showed too much of yourself. Hyunjin's eyes softened. Felix continued, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me that love can be a safe place, a place where I don't have to hide. Gathered in Hyunjin's eyes, Felix opened his hand. Resting in his palm were two simple silver rings. Hyunjin's breath caught. These aren't promises for today only, Felix whispered. They're promises for every ordinary morning and every difficult night. His smile trembled. I'm not asking for perfection. He slipped one ring between his fingers. I'm asking if you'll keep choosing me the way you did that night in the rain. Spilled down Hyunjin's cheeks, Felix's own eyes blurred. Will you stay? For a moment, Hyunjin could not speak. His shoulders shook as he covered his mouth with one hand. Then he laughed through his tears and nodded. Yes. The word came out broken and beautiful. Yes, Felix. 1,000 times yes. Slid the silver ring onto Hyunjin's finger. Hyunjin did the same. His hands trembling so much that he nearly dropped the second ring. Once it was in place, he stared at Felix as though the world had narrowed to this single, perfect moment. Then he pulled Felix into his arms. The kiss they shared tasted of tears, salt air, and promises. When they finally parted, Hyunjin pressed their joined hands to his heart. I thought forever would scare me, he whispered. Felix smiled. And now, Hyunjin touched their rings, his eyes shining in the fading light. Now forever sounds too short. Sun disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving the sky awash in deep purple and silver. They lay together on the blanket until stars emerged one by one. Felix rested his head on Hyunjin's chest, tracing circles over the ring on Hyunjin's finger. Do you think we'll still come here when we're old? Hyunjin kissed his hair. I think you'll still steal all the blankets. Laughed. And you'll still paint me when I'm asleep. Hyunjin tightened his embrace. I'll still tell you that you're beautiful. Looked up at him. And I'll still believe you. Weeks later, they returned to Seoul. Life became busy again. There were recordings, rehearsals, interviews, and long nights that left them exhausted. But everything felt different. No matter how demanding the world became, they carried the memory of that beach with them. The silver rings hidden on chains beneath their shirts. the knowledge that they had chosen each other, over and over, without hesitation. One snowy evening, after a long day in the studio, Felix found Hyunjin standing by the window of their room. Snow drifted softly outside, covering the city in white. Hyunjin turned as Felix entered. Without a word, he opened his arms. Felix stepped into them instantly. They stood together in the quiet, wrapped in warmth and the gentle sound of their breathing. Hyunjin pressed a kiss to Felix's temple. "Do you remember what I told you that night by the river?" Felix smiled against his shoulder. "Every word." Hyunjin lifted Felix's chin so their eyes met. The same devotion shone there as it had from the beginning. "I meant it then," Hyunjin whispered. His fingers brushed the ring beneath Felix's shirt. "And I mean it even more now." Eyes filled with tears of happiness, Hyunjin held him close and murmured the words that had become the foundation of their love. "I will never let you go," wrapped his arms around him, heart overflowing. "And I will never stop coming back to you." Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, two hearts beat together in perfect, steadfast rhythm. And in each other's arms, Felix and Hyunjin discovered that the greatest love stories are not defined by grand gestures alone. They are written in quiet promises, in healing old wounds, in choosing one another every day, and in holding on with a love so gentle, so unwavering, and so true that neither of them would ever have to wonder where they belonged again, because they already knew. They belonged in the embrace that had turned fear into faith, loneliness into home, and love into forever. Years passed, and the promise they made to each other never faded. The silver rings that once rested on chains beneath their shirts were eventually worn openly, no longer hidden close to their hearts because they had become part of who they were. Their love, once whispered in the rain and guarded in sketches and unfinished songs, settled into the quiet rhythm of everyday life. And that rhythm was more beautiful than either of them had imagined. It lived in soft mornings when Felix woke first and padded barefoot into the kitchen to make coffee, while Hyunjin painted by the window in oversized sweaters and sleepy eyes. It lived in the music that drifted through their home as Felix tested melodies at the piano and Hyunjin hummed absent-mindedly while mixing colors on his palette. It lived in the comfortable silences between them, where words were unnecessary because they had learned to read each other's hearts with a single glance. Their home and soul was filled with evidence of the life they had built together. Sketchbooks stacked beside lyric notebooks, paint stains on old shirts, photographs from Australia tucked into frames along the walls, canvases of Felix in every season of their lives, laughing, crying, singing, sleeping, growing older, and songs inspired by Hyunjin's unwavering devotion. Some days were still difficult. There were moments when old fears resurfaced. Hyunjin occasionally woke from dreams in which he was abandoned once more. Felix still had nights when self-doubt crept in, whispering that he was not enough. But they no longer faced those shadows alone. When Hyunjin trembled, Felix held him until his breathing steadied. When Felix questioned his worth, Hyunjin took his face in both hands and reminded him, with fierce tenderness, exactly who he was. "You are my favorite person in the world." Years after their confession, those words still made Felix cry. One spring afternoon, Felix returned home to find the living room transformed. Candles flickered across every surface. Fresh flowers filled the air with a sweet fragrance. And on the walls hung paintings that told the story of their love, the rain-soaked riverside, the candle-lit dance studio, the rooftop under the stars, the beach in Australia, the snowy night by the window. At the center of the room stood Hyunjin. He wore the same nervous expression he had worn the first time he confessed. Felix's heart pounded. "Hyunjin?" Hyunjin stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. "You once asked me if I would keep choosing you." Eyes were already filling with tears. Hyunjin smiled softly. "I have chosen you every day since." He reached into his pocket and took out a velvet box. Inside were 2 gold bands, simple and elegant. Felix covered his mouth, overwhelmed. Hyunjin's voice shook with emotion. "You are the safest place I've ever known. You are the song that calms my fears and the light that found me when I was lost." A tear slipped down his cheek. "I loved you in secret for years." Opened the box fully. "Now I want to love you openly for the rest of my life." Hyunjin sank to one knee. Felix sobbed. "Felix, will you marry me?" For a moment Felix could not speak. He could only stare at the man who had turned his loneliness into belonging, the man who held him in the rain and promised never to let him go, the man who kept that promise every single day. Felix fell to his knees in front of him. He whispered through tears, then louder. Yes. Yes, of course I will. Hyunjin slid the ring onto Felix's finger. Felix placed the other ring on Hyunjin's trembling hand. They kissed while tears streamed freely down both their faces. The applause that followed startled them. They turned to see their family and closest friends stepping out from the hallway, smiling and wiping away tears of their own. Felix laughed, hiding his face against Hyunjin's shoulder. You planned this, Hyunjin grinned. For months. Wedding took place at sunset on the same Australian beach where they had exchanged their first promise rings. The ocean stretched endlessly behind them. The sky blushed with shades of gold and pink. Barefoot in the sand, Felix walked toward Hyunjin as the sound of gentle waves filled the air. Hyunjin looked at him with the same awe he had worn from the beginning, as if Felix were still the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. When they exchanged vows, neither tried to sound perfect. They spoke from the heart. Felix promised to be a home Hyunjin could always return to. Hyunjin promised to hold Felix with the same devotion he had shown on that rain-soaked night by the river. And when it was time for their first kiss as husbands, the world seemed to dissolve around them. There was only the ocean, the sky, and the certainty that they had found the love they had once been too afraid to name. Many years later, their hair carried hints of silver, lines softened their smiles, but their love remained unchanged. One quiet evening, they sat together on the porch of their seaside home. The sunset painted the horizon in familiar shades of gold and rose. Felix rested against Hyunjin's shoulder, their fingers intertwined, wedding rings catching the fading light. The air smelled of salt and blooming flowers. Waves rolled steadily toward shore. Hyunjin turned to look at the man he had loved for nearly a lifetime. His eyes were just as tender as they had been that first night in the rain. He brushed a silver strand from Felix's forehead and whispered the words that had defined their story from the very beginning. I will never let you go. Smiled, his eyes shining with tears of joy and gratitude. He leaned forward and kissed Hyunjin slowly, lovingly, with all the devotion of a life shared. When they parted, Felix rested his forehead against his husband's and answered with the same certainty he had carried for decades. You never did. The sun slipped beneath the horizon. The stars appeared overhead. And wrapped in each other's arms, Felix and Hyunjin sat in the quiet beauty of everything they had built together. A love born from fear, strengthened by trust, and sustained by a promise that endured through every season of their lives. A promise to stay, a promise to hold on, a promise to love without end.